Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. So, we finally have the specs, and even if you are, like me, a PC-only gamer, well, this is going to matter. Today, we're going to run through the new Xbox Series X tech specs and features. We're going to show you roughly what it actually all equates to in terms of a custom-built PC, and we're also going to talk about what this could do for the industry. Because, yes, for once here, we actually have got something reasonably exciting to talk about in terms of the broader effect it's going to have. Also, now, if you're new here, then hello, we're Narrative Game Studio. Hit up our mailing list and site down below. We do 6 game industry news and analysis videos per week, so sub for more of that, hit that like button, drop those comments if you want to help us out with the algorithm, and with that said, let's get into the video. Microsoft are remarkably confident, I would say. It's at least 7 or 8 months until next gen's release, and they've just spilled the beans on their new console, pretty much entirely in terms of features, and on paper it actually sounds fantastic, and calling it next gen from a power and experience perspective, well, that might actually be true this time, unlike it was, I would say, with the base Xbox One and PS4 of 7 or so years ago. To begin with, their custom Zen 2 CPU seems great, especially for a console. You're dealing with 8 cores, one of which is reserved for the OS, and all of which run at 3.8 GHz. Now, it can also run those 8 cores on 16 threads at a slightly slower 3.6 GHz, with devs being able to choose what mode suits their engine better. Then also, it turns out, those are the locked clock speeds. They're not boost clocks, right? And that also means that they're not going to be thermal throttling under those numbers in regular use. And that pretty much means devs know exactly what performance they're going to be able to get, and in terms of multi-threaded, it's really good. Now, for the GPU, it gets a little bit more complicated, so it's a custom RDNA 2 GPU that's capable of 12 teraflops. The new architecture gives it variable rate shading and hardware-level ray tracing, which is actually quite important, and that does also line it up with the more important features of NVIDIA's current lineup and the near-future AMD GPU lineup. Now, Digital Foundry showed off a Gears 5 Series X port that was thrown together in 2 weeks, and it seemed to be running beautifully at the PC Ultra preset. So basically, this GPU seems to be on par with what higher-end gaming PCs have got for, well, at least for now. It's going to be a while out, but this could definitely be quite a beautiful generation, and it could normalize things like real-time ray tracing, which would actually mean that for a developer, it would be worth bothering with ray tracing, which would be nice. It would push that tech forward a little bit, and we might actually start to see more impactful uses of it, instead of just say, you know what, like Battlefield 5 did. Now, looking at these specs, it's fairly obvious that they're going to blow the existing console experience completely out of the water. Even at that, I actually suspect that the biggest upgrade the players will, in a way, care about is the SSD. Moving from busted old hard drives straight up to a modern NVMe SSD is going to massively improve just about everything in terms of console feel. Just load times, general responsiveness, those things will be massively improved. Now, of course, that's tech that us PC gamers have been availing of for, well, absolutely years now, but here's what matters. All games being able to design around faster loading could really help us out just across the board. And then also in terms of size, a terabyte is a pretty big improvement, and that's also combined apparently with other space-saving measures. Now, that 1 terabyte can be expanded via a proprietary third-party SSD card, which, I mean, yeah, that does bring back the pretty horrible visions of the really expensive Vita memory cards. Now, to aid with that storage, they've also talked about new Xbox Velocity architecture, which is obviously just a cool marketing-friendly way of them talking about some under-the-hood improvements they've made to storage and loading times. Now, they claim that this effectively elements load times and makes 100 gigs of assets available instantly to devs, so basically a full game or two. Now, look, that's marketing talk stuff. It's going to sound overblown, but in terms of a baseline improvement, it could be noticeable, right? I'll say that much. Now, the best part here is that a lot of the improvement is thanks to the direct storage API, so that's something developers can use, and that's coming to Windows. And I think that's a good example of a rising tide carrying all ships, with these improvements actually being good for PC gamers as well. Now, on the topic of PC gaming, let's actually make those loose comparisons to modern PCs, at least just in terms of the raw power. So if you do that, you see that the CPU is similar enough to a Ryzen 3700X. That's an 8-core Zen 2 CPU with a base clock of 3.6 GHz. It's a brilliant processor, and it's about $300. Now, there are loads of comparable SSDs in the market. 1TB PCIe 4 SSD usually is about $200. Now, for the GPU front, it's way harder. AMD's highest-end GPU right now is the 5700 XT, and that pales in comparison to what these consoles are running with, but the 5700 XT is really just a mid-range card. AMD actually don't have a modern equivalent to the 2080 Ti, so in terms of raw power, like the 2080 Ti would beat the Xbox Series X, but also it costs $1,200. So to be clear here, on the GPU side of things, it really is apples to oranges just because of different architectures and things. Basically, we'll have to see what cards AMD releases in their next wave of products to make a better comparison with these consoles. But for now, it does seem that the CPU and GPU are nothing that us PC gamers can laugh at. Now, if you've been adding up the costs as we went on here, it's looking like the equivalent CPU and SSD, just them are like $500 for an end user purchasing it just from the regular consumer market, never mind all the other things. So at least for the beginning of this gen, based on the pure power alone, the Xbox Series X and PS5 actually could be quite appealing. I doubt they'll be cheap, but in terms of gaming specs alone, they could be very competitive with gaming PCs. At least for a year or two, because the consoles, of course, are always stuck in time, whereas with PC, you're going to be getting generational CPU and GPU improvements. At least though I'll say this, it seems like the next gen is going to be starting off in a way better state than the current one. So yes, in terms of performance, it seems like they're doing a good job. But as we know, performance isn't everything, and the competition is going to be running like pretty similar hardware, right? The PS5 is not going to be fundamentally that different. Where they can really differentiate themselves though is on features and services. So on that front, they've also made some nice announcements. We've got Quick Resume, so this is basically something that will allow for multiple games to have save states. And looking at the footage, I mean, it looks pretty smooth. It seems like a good improvement on the current gen sort of, suspend your game and pick it up later features. So it's pretty cool. It also persists through boots, which means that the save states will be stored on the SSD. So there's that. Pretty good stuff. There's also dynamic input latency, which is really just a nice way of them saying that they're making improvements to latency across the pipeline. This is going to, of course, widen the gap between streaming services and just playing at home on your console. Although, I mean, it mostly does boil down to things like, say, faster polling rates and then tools for developers, more just dev stuff to understand. Now, I would say this, the fact that such an overlooked part of the gaming experience is being talked about in a marketing blog, that really does bode well for the future, like that they're caring about 120 frames per second, that they're caring about input latency. That is so good. I mean, just between this and even them supporting 120 FPS, games might actually start to feel good on console, finally. Now, that's not to say the next-gen console games will be targeting 120 FPS, but at least that'll be a luxury that's maybe afforded to older Xbox games, and it seems like developers will be able to, have the choice of, frame rate and visuals. Which again means that if you're playing games on a console, they're probably going to feel a lot better than they do today. And I think this is also all quite good with their commitment to backwards compatibility, and then also the smart delivery system, which of course we know about already. And they're really good things for customers. I think it's remarkably clear just letting customers buy a game once, when in reality, double dipping is the norm in our industry. And hopefully that's an attitude that continues across all of their decision making. I think it's really where Microsoft are winning. Now, the console itself, I mean, if I look at it visually, it certainly is interesting. There's all the fridge jokes. At Digital Foundry, we're told that the new design is all in service of thermals, and that's hardly a surprise. I mean, they've basically made a standing wind tunnel, and it almost reminds me actually of the 2013 trash can Mac Pro, which there's just aspects of it kind of seem similar. Now, the current consoles are a nightmare for heat and noise, so Microsoft designing here for function over form. It's going to be good for heat, it's going to be good for noise, that's exactly what we want. Now, for the controller, there's really not that much to say here. It just looks like a generational improvement that takes some inspirations from the Elite Series 2 controller, which is extremely expensive, but is an incredible piece of work. I really do like mine. Older controllers will still be compatible with the console as well, which is another great pro-consumer move, and those old controllers are even going to be receiving a firmware update to add some of the new latency improvements. So, again, all good stuff. And with these details covered, let's actually talk about that good stuff and specifically what it means for us. Now, as far as their approach goes, I think being upfront with all this info does make Microsoft just look really confident. Inviting Digital Foundry to poke and prod around their console like a half a year in advance, that's basically flexing, but it also sets a really good precedent for us as consumers, because if Microsoft misrepresent any of this marketing, they're going to be dragged over the coals because they revealed so much at this stage. Now, they still do use a lot of jargon, but they actually seem to be using accurate jargon, which is a good thing. Basically, right, it seems like this is the best they can do until they've actually got new games to show. And really, I think this type of hardware in terms of power, that being more normal, is a really exciting thing for us. I mean, so many games right now, they're developed for 7-year-old hardware, right? The base Xbox One. And that means that they're clearly held back versus what a mid or even maxed out PC can do. So a new wave of consoles, right, that will raise that bar, and that will pretty much lead to an improvement in standards across the board, which is pretty much good for everyone. So with that covered, what about the PS5? Because I mean, all of this stuff does make Microsoft look quite strong in comparison to Sony, who have released pretty much nothing in terms of concrete info. I mean, they've just talked broadly about things, but not this level of specifics. That said, there is a report from Jack of All Controllers. Now, that points out that the Xbox Series X GPU is exactly what a leaker said it would be. So that means that leaker could also be right about the PS5 GPU, and if that's the case, then it would be marginally more powerful, but only really by one metric. Without knowing the specs, I don't think that means too much. Now, developers have had nothing but praise for the SSD in the PS5, so it's going to be on par with the Series X, if not better. And in terms of the core features, these consoles do seem to be remarkably similar. They are different. I mean, look, they're different flavors of brand new gaming PCs. Now, that said, they put an emphasis on convenience and experience like consoles usually do, and I think this gen, as many before it, will just boil down to which console has got the better games and feels better to play on. I think that quick resume, expandable storage, latency improvements, smart delivery, all those things from Xbox are a great start that go along with their pretty good value services, but the be-all end-all is video games, and I think it still is going to be that for this next gen. It has been for every gen so far, right? So that's going to be where it's more challenging. Xbox does not have a ton of studios with games ready to go, whereas Sony seem to have been working on a lot of things secretly and do seem to have more development resources free. Sony also are going to have the advantage of PS5 exclusives being able to sort of force sales of new consoles, and that could make the initial shipment reports for the consoles more one-sided, whereas of course for Microsoft, you can just get their exclusives on PC. Basically, I think it's going to be a bit of a bloodbath of a console launch. I think it'll be super aggro, but hopefully this arms race will result in more beautiful games, and importantly, ones that are actually good experiences on console. They'll play better, better frame rates, less latency, they'll load faster, and hopefully the consoles will be better to use. And then for many of us who are PC gamers, again, this comes down to raising the bar and making more technologies an actual standard in the industry. If SSDs are the norm, then what does that mean for us? Well, it probably means the developers will be thinking, what can we do when load times are faster? Maybe there'll be there's new technologies, right? New APIs like with what Microsoft have that is actually making it to PC. That's really good. Take ray tracing. Ray tracing is really incredible technology, and if you look at it and say Minecraft, it's gorgeous. There's so much potential to ray tracing, but on PC, well, to get ray tracing and to actually get ray tracing with any level of okay performance, you need a really expensive graphics card. And AMD don't really have good options for that right now. Whereas with these consoles coming out, that basically makes ray tracing the default for loads of people. And that actually means that when developers are trying to think about how to make their games look really nice, well, they can maybe embrace ray tracing fully. So this actually could be really good for just pushing technological standards upwards, forwards across the industry. And if that happens, it'll basically it'll radiate, right? The positive effect will radiate, and I think for us as PC gamers, it's going to lead to games that do a better job of actually fully using our PCs, which I think ultimately is what we want. So there you go. Let me know, what do you think about this new gen? How do you think it's going to sort of be a rising tide in terms of new tech? Just what things are you excited about? Tell me down below. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.